This week I decided to do my podcast review on the PKA podcast. The Painkiller Already podcast is the full name of it. And so basically they're a bunch of older YouTuber content creators that basically over time stopped really talking about video games as time has gone on with their podcast and now talks about more of the events that happened in the past in the actual gaming community. And so now their format is similar to Cameron and ours. It's very conversational, and the only downside to this podcast really is that it's 4 hours long. And the way that they keep their audience's attention is by the way that it's the stories that they tell. Because I had to actually, when I was watching it originally, because this is all recorded because they all have cams for it, I started playing it in the background, but then it's the topics that they really start talking about. Well, like in this episode particularly, this is episode 383 to be exact. They started talking about an older member of the podcast named Wings of Redemption, who they had to remove from the podcast due to a lot of things that he did wrong with them, like. But yeah, basically the stories that they tell and the guests that they bring on, who in this case usually like they're interested to know about what happened in the past or what led to this particular person to get removed. And so in this podcast, I definitely have to say that I want to recommend you watch it, but at the same time I don't, because once it hits that 2 hour mark, I think you need to stop watching it because yeah. Yeah, I don't recommend you watch it at that 2 hour mark. But at the same time, this podcast is it's interesting to see how they keep audiences' attention for 4 hours long. And so eventually I want to get to the point to a podcast where I can do at least an hour, but a whole solid 4 hours, almost at 40 minutes, a whole solid 4 hours of a podcast. I don't know how that's possible, but watching them and the way that they communicate with amongst themselves and with their audiences, it makes me like reevaluate how me and Cameron did our podcast a couple weeks ago, because I feel like I was talking a little bit more than Cameron was, and now that I'm noticing that, I want to try to find a common ground with Cameron and try to be like find a way to change up the conversation to where I'm not talking as much as I was in that last one. But at the end of the day, this podcast, the actual podcast itself, I recommend, but more specifically, if you want to talk about like the thing that the Wings of Redemption thing, if you want background on that, just look up Wings of Redemption versus Syndicate Project on Bog. Definitely, that'll explain a lot, because this podcast talks about how Twitch streaming, which eventually is a topic I want to talk about on our podcast with Cameron. This podcast, like with that 1v1, led to like Twitch becoming a very well-renowned thing, because the creator of Twitch, Justin TV, I believe that was his name, he tried to host a tournament, a rematch between Syndicate and Wings, but it fell through. I won't get into that unless you want to go and watch that for yourself. But at the same time, at the end of the day, what I'm taking from this podcast is that you have to be a little bit more open. And granted, like thinking back to how me and Cameron talked, we were a little stiff, and I think it was more because of nerves, if anything, because these guys now are at 400 plus episodes, so they're used to talking on camera, and I'm used to talking to you through this like this because of last semester. So at the end of the day, I just have to go in there and really talk to Cameron, and really we have to find a way to not separate ourselves, but to find a way to get comfortable talking together, because I believe that's our biggest struggle at working together in a podcast. But thank you for watching this video, I guess. And again, if you're interested, Syndicate Project versus Wings of Redemption, Bog, and Painkiller Already podcast, episode 383.